Welcome, I'm Rose Aguilar, and this is your Calls Media Roundtable. Today we are spending the hour discussing coverage of the election, which is just 87 days away. Yesterday, Donald Trump gave an hour-long, unhinged press conference full of lies and insults. He insulted Vice President Kamala Harris, mispronounced her name as he always does, and once again questioned her identity. He repeated his homophobic, racist, and anti-immigrant rants and said he would consider banning the abortion pill mifepristone. For some reason, this is not getting as much attention as it deserves. But once again, he lied about abortions and killing babies after birth.
The Democrats are really the radical ones on this because they're allowed to do abortion on the 8th and 9th month and even after birth. If you look at your new governor from Minnesota, he's like the governor previous, the former governor. I don't want to get him mixed up because Glenn is doing a good job and he's leading our whole campaign in Virginia, Glenn Youngkin. But previous to Glenn, the governor, he said the baby will be born, we will put the baby aside and we will decide with the mother what we're going to do. In other words, whether or not we're going to kill the baby. The Minnesota gentleman, this guy agrees with that. He is the most liberal. Look.
Right after Trump's press conference with reporters, Vice President Kamala Harris and Minnesota Governor Tim Walz gave speeches and met with UAW members at the UAW Local 900 Union Hall in Wayne, Michigan. The UAW has endorsed Kamala Harris for president, saying, quote, years before the stand-up strike, Kamala Harris walked the picket line with striking auto workers in 2019, has taken on corporate price gouging and profiteering, and has spoken out and voted against unfair trade deals that hurt the American worker like NAFTA and NAFTA 2.0. Here is Kamala Harris.
We know what we stand for, and we stand for the people. And we stand for the dignity of work. And we stand for freedom. We stand for justice. We stand for equality. And so we will fight for all of it. And the bottom line about UAW is that I also know, and I'll say to all the friends watching, look, even if you're not a member of a union, you better thank unions for that 5-day work week. You better thank unions for that 8-hour work day. You better thank unions for that vacation time. So I'm here to say thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you to the sisters and brothers of UAW for all you are and all we will do over these next 89 days. God bless you.
On MSNBC last night, Lawrence O'Donnell said all of the networks, including his, ran Trump's entire press conference and none ran Harris's UAW speech. Here is Lawrence O'Donnell saying it's 2016 all over again. The media are making the same mistakes.
I have never seen an industry slower at learning from its own stupid mistakes than the American news business. And you cannot expect them in the next 89 days to figure out what they haven't been able to figure out in 9 years, how to cover a Trump for president campaign. One of the Harris-Walz campaign slogans now is, we're not going back. But we just went back today. We went back 9 years in the press coverage of the campaign, the media coverage. Donald Trump gets credit from the people he lied to today for lying to them. They appreciate it. Reporters understandably and incorrectly believe that the most important thing a candidate can do is answer their questions. But they don't know what an answer actually is. Words spoken after their question marks are not necessarily answers and are never answers when they come from Donald Trump.
Well, there's a lot of noise out there, and here is a story that deserves far more attention about Donald Trump's election plans. Recently, Democracy Docket's Mark Elias tweeted, Republicans are building an election subversion war machine. They have sacrificed traditional get-out-the-vote activity to fund and recruit for their massive voter suppression program. This morning, Mother Jones reporter Ari Berman is out with a piece called MAGA Election Deniers Are Going All Out to Rig Georgia for Trump. The right-wing majority on the state election board passed a new rule this week that could embolden counties not to certify elections if Democrats win. NPR covered this yesterday. Joining us to talk about all of this are three guests. David Perry is a journalist and assistant director of undergraduate studies in the history department at the University of Minnesota, and he knows Governor Walz's policies very well. David Perry is co-author of The Bright Ages, A New History of Medieval Europe. Hi, David. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks so much for having me.
Great to have you. Will Bunch is an award-winning journalist and national opinion columnist for the Philadelphia Inquirer. Will Bunch has written several books on politics, including his latest, After the Ivory Tower Falls, How College Broke the American Dream and Blew Up Our Politics and How to Fix It. Hi, Will. Thank you for joining us again.
Yeah, hi, Rose. Thanks for having me back. I appreciate it.
Great to have you. Chris Lehman is D.C. bureau chief for The Nation and contributing editor at The Baffler. He was formerly editor of The Baffler and The New Republic and is author most recently of The Money Cult, Capitalism, Christianity, and the Unmaking of the American Dream. Hi, Chris. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks, Rose. Happy to be here.
Well, great to have all of you. I just wonder what your thoughts are about how you think the media should cover Trump. I mean, in addition to what I laid out in the intro there, and he just lied. He said he took a helicopter ride with Willie Brown. Willie Brown says it never happened. He's still obsessing over his crowd size. And while this is happening, there's a lot going on that's not getting the attention it deserves. So, Will, let's start with you. How do you think this all should be dealt with?
Yeah, I'm so glad we're talking about this. I mean, there were two things that really appalled me about the press conference and the coverage yesterday. And, I've been disappointed in the state of political journalism in 2024 generally. But I thought the last couple of days have seemed to just kind of been a rock bottom point. And I mean, the 2 points I would make about the news conference is, one, it was really shocking just how unhinged Trump was. He was clearly angry. He was clearly out of sorts. And, in terms of fact checking, it almost would have been better if you'd had a fact checker just, publishing the 2 or 3 things that were true rather than the 30 or 40 things that were lies, about, crime is terrible and the stock market's about to crash and World War III is about to start and, the United States is a terrible country. And I mean, that's not a fact. That's an opinion. But I mean, that was the tone of it. And I was very disappointed. I think a lot of the news coverage in the big mainstream outlets, the New York Times and elsewhere, just didn't really reflect just how unhinged this was. I mean, it was understandable when people, after the debate in late June, it was understandable that people said, Biden was confused and unfocused and maybe he should drop out. But why not have a similar conversation about the way that Trump behaved yesterday? So that was number one. And number two, and you kind of hinted at this, is, he did take questions, to his credit, I guess. But the questions were not very good. There were just so many substantive things that he should have been asked about. One that I tweeted about this morning and got a lot of response is, the Washington Post had a bombshell report last weekend that there's considerable evidence, some of it circumstantial, but some of it very strong, that the, Egyptian dictator al-Sisi paid this $10 million bribe to help Trump win the 2016 election, which, if true, would, on the 50th anniversary of Richard Nixon's resignation, kind of dwarf Watergate as a scandal. And you would think that somebody would take this golden opportunity to ask Trump to explain and defend his actions, and nobody asked about it. And there were no questions about substance. And, the whole thing was just very disappointing, Rose. It really was.
And for people who have not followed that, just to give a little context here, the Washington Post had a piece called $10 million Cash Withdrawal Drove Secret Probe into Whether Trump Took Money from Egypt. Political appointees rejected efforts to search for additional evidence investigators believed might provide answers, then closed the case. So that's a very important story. Thanks for bringing that up, Will. We should also say that you wrote on Twitter, how is this insane Trump rant not 100 times worse and more frightening than the confusion that Joe Biden experienced at the debate? It must be demanded that Trump drop out immediately. And just wanted to mention that because it is weird when you compare the two. What are your thoughts on this, Chris? How do you think the media should be dealing with what we're seeing from Trump once again?
Well, I'm largely, not surprisingly, going to second what Will just said and what Lawrence O'Donnell said in the clip earlier. This has been kind of a shocking system failure, especially given the media's integral role in 2016 in elevating Trump. This is an industry that is failing to learn from its past mistakes, as O'Donnell said. And I think, the deeper reasons, I've lived in Washington for more than 20 years, and I'm surrounded by this sort of media industrial complex here. And, long ago, Joan Didion wrote a very good essay in which she said basically all American political coverage is theater criticism. And so you will always get these, you saw it instantaneously in the Times' coverage of Trump's press conference yesterday, which was this incoherent wind tunnel of lies and rants and delusions and hate speech. And, Times reporters were just treating it as, well, Trump has sort of laid down a challenge to the Harris campaign by, having a press conference when Harris is not opening herself up to questions from the press. And, that's all just formalist garbage. As Will was saying, it does not engage at all with the substance of what Trump was doing on the stand, which is, it's certainly true that all of the concerns voiced about Biden's debate performance are doubly relevant in the case of Trump. And what's also important to point out, I think, and this is not the kind of analysis we get from the political press, is, the Democratic Party sort of heeded those alarms and went through this very painful, difficult process to replace Biden as its presidential nominee. And the Republican Party is a cult of personality. It is never going to, in its present guise, shed the demented autocratic leader at its top. And that is a very important political fact. That also just never gets reported, that there is no institutional interest in reforming the Republican Party to operate as a political party in a democracy. And that also goes to the story you cited about the Georgia Election Board, which is also incredibly alarming and is skating under the radar because, stories about local organizing and electioneering are just, not of interest to this class of theater critics who are just focusing on the personal performances of the people at the top of the ticket and ignoring the decaying institutional structure beneath them. So, yeah, it is, stunning to be in this position again. I wish I could say we're more surprised, but yeah, the mainstream media just has no equipment to analyze the deep causes of democratic rot in American society.
David, what are your thoughts? What would you like to add?
Well, I'm a historian, and I don't do kind of the day-to-day reporting that other people do, and I respect the people like Chris and Will who have that expertise. I think when Trump gives a news conference, a press conference, it's news, but it's not news that requires live reporting. You go there, you listen, you record things, and then you write a story. You take your time, you analyze it, you check it, you treat it as news. And the other people have been saying this since the 2016 campaign, that none of this stuff has to be done in real time, that we would lose nothing and gain enormously from, and this is not just with Trump, although Trump is the extreme case. This stuff does not have to be done live. Then it becomes theater, as Chris was saying, it becomes performance. If we want to do news, we want to do journalism, get the material, look at it, analyze it, and then present it to the audience in a way that that tells a truer story. So I don't have any hope that in this era of cable news, we're going to go away from these kind of live feeds, let alone journalists sort of live tweeting these press conferences. But I wish we would, and I think it would solve a lot of these problems very quickly if we could.
Well, I want to give out the phone number. If you'd like to jump in here and share your thoughts on media coverage of the election, major media coverage. Have you seen stories out there that you think deserve more attention? We'd love to hear from you. 866-798-8255. You can also email your call at kalw.org. On today's Roundtable, we're joined by David Perry, a journalist and assistant director of undergraduate studies in the history department at the University of Minnesota. Will Bunch is national opinion columnist for the Philadelphia Inquirer and an author. Chris Lehman is DC bureau chief for The Nation and contributing editor at The Baffler, and also an author. Let's talk about Minnesota Governor Tim Walz. We're all learning so much more about him. David, you live in Minnesota. I feel like this week we got a crash course in Minnesota politics. You wrote a piece about Tim Walz for MSNBC. You write that before Vice President Harris chose Governor Tim Walz to be her running mate, you were hoping for him to become the nominee, and it happened. You wrote, "If it happens, I'll be thrilled. I'm a Minnesotan and have watched Walz since he started running for governor in the 2018 election. Before that, he was just a downstate congressman and not so much on my radar." So, David, you did not vote for him, but you say you became a supporter, not so much because of all the viral clips we've seen, but because of everything he's done to make Minnesota a better place for everyone. So talk more about that. What changed your mind?
Yeah, so just to be clear, I didn't vote for him in the 2018 gubernatorial Democratic primary. So it's a very narrow not voting for him. But these are moments in which, you're really looking very closely at candidates. Primary elections really matter. And in this, what seemed to be a blue wave year and did become a blue wave year, I just thought we could get someone who was more progressive, who more closely modeled my values. And I was wrong. And I couldn't be happier to be wrong about it, that the way he has governed, and particularly in the last couple of years, has just been extraordinary. I have never been just a citizen watching my government at work and feeling so inspired as during the 2023 Minnesota legislative session. We had a complete majority in all branches of government, both houses of the state legislature and in the governor's mansion, but only by one seat. And they just did everything. And Walz was, I like to be really clear about this, there are a lot of great lawmakers in Minnesota doing great work, and the legislative leaders in particular were the ones who drove this. But Walz became the face of it. Walz was an enthusiastic participant of it. And Walz, as we have seen this week, he can take things that feel like they're progressive values, but that in fact are pretty common sense. All kids should be able to eat. People should have access to health care, and say them in a way that really communicates across our state, and now it seems like across the country. And so 2023 was a moment in which our state government could do a lot of things. We had Democrats in control. We had a budget surplus. And instead of being cautious, they were bold. And it feels like, based on recent polling data, it's paying off politically, which is good. But even if it wasn't, even if we were about to lose things, it would have paid off in terms of making life better. And that's the Tim Walz argument. And now he's making it to the nation. It's been quite something to see.
And I think this is why, for a lot of people, this is so refreshing, because of the Tim Walz choice, we're actually talking about very popular policies. And people are imagining, what if we could have these policies at a federal level? So you listed his accomplishments, David. These accomplishments made Minnesota a safe haven for the trans community. They affirmed abortion as a fundamental right and removed restrictions. They legalized recreational cannabis use, passed laws for driver's licenses for everyone, regardless of immigration status, automatic voter registration, paid family and medical leave, tax rebates for people making less than $75,000, new climate goals, phasing out parental fees for families with kids on Medicaid. And I know this one is so personal for you, David, because you write that your son has Down syndrome and is on Medicaid. So you paid very close attention to this.
I really did. Yeah. You know, one of the things about having a disability or having a child with a disability is that you are engaged in all levels of government. Our Medicaid program is mandated by the federal government and kind of funded through the state, but administered through the county, right? So you're dealing with government in a way that before my son was born, I had no idea what that was like. I really didn't know. And so as you can imagine, I paid very close attention. It's thousands of dollars a year that we needed to pay out of our salary in order to access benefits. And on the whole, it was pretty good, but it's better now. And also, I just hope our national audience knows how radical some of these things are. I was just reading a quote from the director of Pro-Choice Minnesota, one of our major organizations on abortion rights. And she said, after the 2023 session, we had to go back to the drawing board and come up with new legislative goals because we had accomplished everything that they had worked on for 10 years. And then suddenly they had gotten everything. So now they had to start from scratch again. And it was great. They were delighted to have that as a problem, or not even as a problem. And that's true really across the board. So, I'm an old cynical historian. I'm happy to be very critical of government. I have been so in many pieces, many times I've written. And this moment really broke my cynicism in a way that I never expected.
And don't you think that's why people are so excited right now to go from such a dark time to the possibility of these policies?
I do. And there's always this media criticism, which may not be, I think probably often isn't fair, but that Democrats are only running against Trump, right? They have only a negative message. And I don't think you can say that at all, having watched what's going on with the Harris-Walz campaign in the last couple of weeks.
Mm. Will, you have a fantastic column about Tim Walz's college story and education legislation he signed. And this is really an incredible story. You write, Walz's college story harks back to a now nearly lost moment in the U.S. when higher education was affordable and accessible. A teen enlistee in the Army National Guard, the Nebraska native earned GI Bill benefits that allowed him to attend a college that neither you nor I had ever heard of before this week. Chadron State College, the only four-year university in his rural western corner of the Cornhusker State, which admits anyone with a high school diploma. Will, tell us why it was so important for you to get this story out.
Well, I just think it's a remarkable contrast between the two people who got chosen for vice president, in Tim Walz and J.D. Vance. It's funny because they both start in similar places, right? They were both, children of the working class in the Midwest. They both enlisted in various parts of the military and went to college on the GI Bill. But J.D. Vance got this free ride to Yale and really drilled down on the whole class resentment issue around college. And when he decided he wanted to, become a Republican Party office holder, he just embraced this whole cultural criticism of higher education. And he's got this agenda that would, cut funding for college, eliminate any kind of diversity programs. He basically hates college. And, J.D. Vance on the GI Bill went to this tiny college called Chadron State in the western corner of Nebraska. I'd never heard of it
Tim Walz.
Yeah, I'm sorry. Excuse me. I apologize. Yeah, Tim Walz went to Chadron State in this tiny corner of western Nebraska, and which I and probably most of the listeners had never heard of before this week, if they've heard of it at all, and relished the opportunity he got, and he wants others to have the same opportunity that he had. This is the old-fashioned American dream of college, to do better than your parents, to raise yourself up through knowledge and education. And so as governor, it's funny you mentioned all those progressive programs, which is just this amazing list of things that he's accomplished in Minnesota. But you didn't even mention the fact that he also made public university in Minnesota is now free for any family that makes less than $80,000 a year. And also for the state's Indigenous population, which is significant. And that's not all. He just increased general funding to help boost programs at these universities, and a whole bunch of other daycare for students who are also parents, right? So he really kind of restored this kind of 1950s kind of notion of college as the American dream and a way to work. And I think it just says so much about him. And I think it says so much about the difference between where the Democrats are at right now and where the Republicans are at.
And a couple more things. Tim Walz boosted higher education funding by $650 million, made it easier for adjunct professors and other university employees to unionize, took on the crisis of student food insecurity, and resisted efforts to end diversity programs that have caught fire in other states. No wonder public enrollment in Minnesota jumped 2% last year while it dropped elsewhere. This is according to Will Bunch's column, and you can find it at yourcallradio.org. Actually, nope, sorry, wrong site. KALW.org. Click news, and then click on Your Call. We're going to take a quick break. That is Will Bunch, an award-winning journalist, national opinion columnist for the Philadelphia Inquirer, and author of a book about higher education, After the Ivory Tower Falls, How College Broke the American Dream and Blew Up Our Politics and How to Fix It. David Perry is a journalist and co-author of The Bright Ages, A New History of Medieval Europe. Chris Lehman is D.C. Bureau Chief for The Nation, contributing editor at The Baffler, and author of The Money Cult, Capitalism, Christianity, and the Unmaking of the American Dream. This is Your Calls Media Roundtable. I'm Rose Aguilar. We'll be back after this. This is Your Calls Media Roundtable. Today we're spending the hour discussing media coverage of the election, which is just 87 days away. And a quick public service announcement. I'm sure you're being inundated with texts asking you for money for various candidates or parties. Just be careful. There's a lot of spam going on right now. So make sure that this is an official website or an official text before you give any personal information or any of your money away. Today, we are joined by three journalists. David Perry is a journalist and assistant director of undergraduate studies in the history department at the University of Minnesota. Will Bunch is an award-winning journalist and national opinion columnist for the Philadelphia Inquirer. And Chris Lehman is D.C. Bureau Chief for The Nation and a contributing editor at The Baffler. You can join us at 866-798-8255. You can also email your call at kalw.org. So, Chris, what are your thoughts now that people are learning about Governor Walz and all of these very popular progressive policies? I just want to read a couple tweets. This one is from James Fallows, longtime journalist. He wrote, "They can't help themselves." And he retweeted the upshot from the New York Times. The headline, "With Tim Walz, Kamala Harris passes on a chance to redefine herself." And then Matthew Sheffield on Twitter, a former right-wing operative who is now a progressive writer, wrote, "It's really stunning how many people who claim Democrats should, quote, reach out to rural people really just meant be Paul Ryan. Tim Walz is everything these pundits pretended to want. What they actually wanted was a conservative Democratic Party." What are your thoughts?
Well, once again, I'm just going to second everything you just cited. In fact, Matthew Sheffield's a good friend of mine. There is this kind of, speaking of the kind of brain dead quality of the American political press, there's this bizarre reflex conveyed in the headline of that New York Times tweet you quoted, that, the mission always is for Democratic tickets to pivot, quote, toward the center in any general election. And there's never a corresponding pressure for the Republican Party, which has, skewed so incredibly far right that the center is really no longer a meaningful concept in this sort of patty cake vision of American politics. So you do have this idea that, to be, quote, middle American or from the heartland, we saw it over and over again in New York Times, parachute coverage of the Midwest after Trump was elected. Like, we're going to this exotic region of the country where people support Donald Trump, to interview them ad nauseum about why they support Donald Trump. And, there is actually this very robust progressive populist tradition in the Midwest. I grew up in Iowa. I actually did know where Chadron State was because it's one state over from where I grew up. But, the Walz pick, for a kind of historically literate political press would be a good occasion to revisit, the actual peri-populist tradition that did result in things like the GI Bill and, the food stamps program and on down the line, all of these social democratic protections that we've been talking about that Walz has revived. This is not some, exotic, obscure, out-of-the-way force in our politics. This is actually how Midwestern politics worked for a very long time. It's immensely frustrating as someone who grew up in that part of the country and, saw all the baleful things that did help create the Trump phenomenon. The part of the country I grew up in was devastated by the farm crisis in the 1980s and lost manufacturing jobs in the wake of NAFTA. One of the things that's really encouraging about the Walz choice, apart from the geography, is also, I believe he is the first Democratic candidate on a presidential ticket in 50 years not to have attended law school. He's also a former union member, which has not been the case on a Democratic ticket for a very long time as well. To sort of pan back at what's happened to the Democratic Party over the past generation, in the 90s, there was a very deliberate decision to rebrand the Democrats as a pro-business party to regain the White House after the debacle of Ronald Reagan's reelection. And so that's how Democrats, wound up supporting things like NAFTA, which was actually largely negotiated by George H.W. Bush prior to Bill Clinton's presidency, and wound up in this romance with the sort of Silicon Valley knowledge elite that has been running things in the party for a long time. In fact, there's this very telling anecdote from Walz's first congressional run in Minnesota where someone from the state came to Rahm Emanuel, who was, a protege of the Clinton White House and was running the Democratic campaign congressional committee at the time. And this person said, we have this really interesting candidate in Minnesota who's, looks like he could really win. And he's in this traditionally very Republican district. We should look into supporting him. And Rahm Emanuel just said, no, this is nobody without any money. And that, anecdote says a lot about how the Democratic Party has been operating for the past generation. And it's so heartening to me to see Kamala Harris recognize, the need for a long overdue sort of course correction in terms of the party's class politics.
To that point, what do you think this pick says about the future of the Democratic Party?
Well, it's very much continues to be a work in progress, right? But I think it opens up a new path. I think the fact that Walz is so aggressively pro-labor and, as Will noted, is really a fierce advocate for public education. You're already seeing Walz in rally speeches and media appearances saying that, you hear all this rhetoric on the right, but we're the actual party of family values, right? We are making it possible for your kids to go to school and not be hungry. We're making it possible for you to afford health care and have job security through a union. We're making it possible for you to revive the American dream, as Will was describing earlier. These are solid American home truths about our democracy that the Democratic Party has, for bizarre reasons, in my view, been reluctant to embrace. And you're seeing that embrace happen. And I think a lot could change on that basis. It's early, obviously.
Hearing you talk, it makes me think about the pundits who always say, they've got to tack to the center when they're talking to the voters, whatever that means.
Right.
And Tim Walz is not changing his message. I want to play a quick clip, and then I will ask you all to respond. Here is Governor Tim Walz talking about IVF. That is how he and his wife had their first daughter, Hope, and the hypocrisy of the Republican Party's claims to stand for family values.
Yeah, first of all, it was up to him. I wouldn't have a family because of IVF and the things that we need to do reproductive. My kids were born through that that way. And also I make sure that I'm the guys and our folks are investing in prenatal care. We're the ones that are there for universal pre-K. We're the ones that are providing school meals at this. I'm not going to back down one bit on this whole family values thing, and it's us. That construct that he's putting out there is absolutely untrue. We're making it more affordable to have children by having paid family and medical leave so that you can go home when your kids are sick and take care of them. Or if you're a dad, I don't have to go right back to work 5 days later after my wife had a C-section because our insurance wouldn't pay for it. We're boosting those things up. There's nothing pro-family other than having women be incubators for their vision of this. And I don't know. Once again, it's weird. I don't want J.D. Vance talking about my family. I certainly don't want him talking about my daughter or my wife. It's none of his damn business. But I said the one thing is we need to talk about how we've invested in families. We have the most generous child tax credit, and it's what Vice President Harris is proposing for the country, that people are poor because they don't have money. And when kids don't have the money on the front end, all of the things that a chain reaction of can't learn, can't go on. So I'll challenge him on that. Where's J.D. Vance's pro-family? He's forcing people to have, not be able to have medical care if they have a bad pregnancy or something. We need to stand in front of that. And again, you don't need me to give a sermon, but try and live one. Try and be decent. Try and help your neighbors. Try and invest in those kids.
Will Bunch, what do you think the message that Kamala Harris is sending by choosing Tim Walz to be her running mate, and what do you think this means for the future of the Democratic Party?
Yeah, well, I think that was a great soundbite. I think it really shows why this pick was a home run because, here's a guy. He's done all these progressive policies. I mean, he's not just talking about implementing them. He's actually put them into place in Minnesota, and Minnesota is booming. It's a very successful state. And it's doing it with these progressive policies, and he's showing the way forward. It's fascinating. I was thinking about if you remember 8 years ago, when Hillary Clinton picked Tim Kaine to be her running mate, that was a half day story, right? We kind of rolled our eyes, and nowadays, I bet a lot of voters don't even remember that Tim Kaine was Hillary Clinton's running mate. But this I think is that rare vice presidential choice that can make a difference. And I think part of the reason why, which is interesting, is that Kamala Harris really hasn't given us much of a platform, right? She's given us kind of a broad idea of what her campaign stands for in terms of freedom. There's certainly some things like reproductive rights that are very important to her, and she's talked about a few of these things, but there's not really this filled in policy page on her website or whatever. And part of that's the circumstances, but still, it's like Tim Walz has shown up here and he's given her a platform, basically, right? It's like these are the things we can do because we've done them in Minnesota, and how would you like us to do this for the whole United States? And I think a lot of voters would look at most of these things, and a few of them have culture war angles, and that would make them controversial. But 90% of what he's done, like the school lunches or free college for working class families, is just incredibly popular stuff with everybody. And I think it's a great pick. I live here in Pennsylvania, and Josh Shapiro, our governor, he gave a great speech at that rally, and he would have been an interesting vice presidential choice. He's a great public speaker, and he would have been kind of a pit bull. But it's kind of weird. A lot of people I know here in Pennsylvania and Josh Shapiro's home state were really excited and intrigued by this Tim Walz pick. And so I imagine it's the same impact everywhere. So she really did well.
To your point about Kamala Harris, we should say that she did take reporters' questions after she landed in Michigan yesterday. It wasn't very long, but every single question was about Trump's press conference or J.D. Vance. To your point, Will,
yes.
None of the questions were about actual issues.
And that was very frustrating because, I think it's a valid point that I think it's very valid to say we would like to know more about what she would do. We know, of course, we do know broadly where she stands on a lot of these things. We know, she's, pro doing something on climate change or whatever. But what's her policy on climate change? We don't really know. She said she no longer supports the fracking ban, but that's fine. But what does she support? And here was a chance to ask her a question. What are you going to do about climate change? Some of these other policies. You say you don't support Medicare for all anymore. So what do you support to expand healthcare? And hopefully in the next 87 days, there'll be a forum where she can answer some of these questions. But until now, it's a little frustrating. I think her answers would be good, probably, but I'd like to hear what they are,
Yeah, and she did tell reporters that they're putting together a wide press conference at the end of the month. And I thought, well, why not sooner? But we're going to definitely keep track of that and do shows about her policies. David, before we get to calls, and thank you all for holding. I'm so sorry it's taken long to get to you. David, just before we get to calls, given that you're from Minnesota, what do you think this pick says about the future of the Democratic Party? And do you think that what we're seeing in Minnesota is a blueprint for what we could see across the country?
Well, I hope so. I think they have to win for it to be the blueprint of the Democratic Party. And so I hope they do. What I love about that clip you play is the way that Walz gives a personal story, either about his family or about people, real people, though, and then he connects it to a policy each time. And if it's a negative policy, if it's a criticism, again, he's talking about people in a really direct kind of way. I was thinking about, he was talking about IVF, his son, who has gotten a little less attention, but there's a very good story, I think, in Today recently. His son is nonverbal. My son is also nonverbal. So I read that very carefully. And, just kind of the compassion that Walz talks about his son and his support of his son, and then again goes into the policy, the ways in which government can impact his son's life and my son's life in this very direct way. And I can a story that just came out about Donald Trump meeting his nephew, and his nephew is the father of a disabled child, and Trump saying allegedly, wouldn't it be better if your son was just dead? That for me as the father of a disabled child, I just keep going back to that story and then comparing it to Governor Walz and his son Gus, and it makes me very emotional, and it makes me hope that the Walz vision is the one that runs the country for the next few years.
That is just, oh my gosh, I didn't know that about Tim Walz's son, and I can't even imagine what that's like to have to hear this. Another story, David, that kind of came and went. I'm just looking at a couple headlines. CBC, Donald Trump said disabled people should just die, according to his nephew. I mean, it did get coverage, but it didn't last that long. Time magazine, Donald Trump told me disabled Americans should just die. And I'm sorry for saying these things on the air. It's so ugly, David. The other thing, since you brought this up, and I'm sorry, we're going to get to calls in a minute. I just have to bring this up. When Kamala Harris introduced Tim Walz, she talked about, and you write about this, Chris, she talked about the student group that he embraced and started when he was a football coach at Mankato High School, the LGBTQ student group. And I think this is so important, David, because the things that the Republicans are saying about the LGBTQ community are just so shameful. And they have real life consequences on the ground. And it was just, the bar is low, but that moment really, really stood out for me, that she proudly talked about what Tim Walz did for that LGBTQ student group.
On one level, I'm just a Midwestern dad. I have a disabled child and I have a trans child. So this is me. This is me and my family, and the way that my relationship to the state is going to be over the foreseeable future. So I feel very invested. But I have to say, in the last week or two, I feel much more hopeful than I did, say, in mid-June.
Well, That is David Perry, a journalist and assistant director of undergraduate studies in the history department at the University of Minnesota. Will Bunch is a national opinion columnist for the Philadelphia Inquirer. Chris Lehman is DC bureau chief for The Nation. Let's go to a couple of calls and emails, and then we'll get final thoughts from our guests. Thank you all for holding. Bruce in Piedmont. Hi, Bruce.
Hi. The story is shocking about MAGA efforts to fix the election by installing election officials who refuse to certify the results. So I have three questions. How can the media better inform us about what's being done to resist this attack on democracy? What organizations are fighting it? And what can ordinary people do? We need to know who we can support to prevent this calamity from happening.
Thank you. We're going to take a few more calls and then we'll talk more about that. Greg in Palo Alto. Hi, Greg.
Hello. I couldn't agree more with one of your guests who said they'd like to know more about Kamala Harris's policies. I have to say this. I mean, to tell you the truth, I think Walz has got a better record to run on than Harris does. Although I think that the Biden and Harris administration did accomplish some things, but they really got to emphasize that. And I mean, your guests know this, everybody knows it. They need to really make the contrast between themselves and the other lunatics in the Republican Party about what kind of country this is going to be if Donald Trump gets reelected. And they've got to beat that home. And I think Walz is a great choice. I mean, just a little I've heard about him. He sounds amazing, and he's very articulate. And I think he's got to really emphasize, what did we do? And look what we did in Minnesota. That's what we want. And if child care is radical, then just call me a communist, for God's sake.
Well, to your point, Greg, there's this amazing but really devastating story. It says so much about this country. Sports Illustrated has a piece about how American athletes are using their trip to the Olympics to get basic preventative health care they cannot afford in the United States. They're getting free dental, free glasses. So they're getting this in Paris. They can't get it here in the United States. It just says so much. We have a couple of emails. Rick says, I will definitely be voting for Harris Walz. I think they stand up for people like myself with disabilities and medical conditions. I also like their stance on abortion, because this means embryonic stem cells to treat diseases like what I have by physicians at the UCSF Medical Center. Thank you so much for the email, Rick. Anna Marie writes, what are constructive ways to educate the mainstream media? Tweets, threads, letters to the editor? Bruce, the story is shocking about MAGA efforts to fix the election by installing election officials who will refuse to certify the results. How can the media better inform us about what's being done to resist this attack on democracy? What can ordinary people do? So let's end on this one. Ari Berman, and we're going to invite him maybe next week, has a piece today from Mother Jones. MAGA election deniers are going all out to rig the Georgia election for Trump. The right-wing majority on the state election board passed a new rule this week that could embolden counties not to certify elections if Democrats win. Chris, what are your thoughts on this? NPR covered it yesterday. Do you think this is going to get the attention it deserves in the coming weeks?
I wish I could say yes, but based on what we've been discussing all during this hour, the political press is always going to go for the shiny object over the deep institutional reforms that are necessary to save our democracy. As a practical matter, for your listeners, I think you mentioned when you first cited the Ari Berman piece, Democracy Docket, which is Mark Elias's election law outfit, has been doing great work on the ground in all of these jurisdictions to challenge these power grabs on the part of Republican officials. So that's one place I would say you could direct your attention and resources if you have them. As to what to do about the press covering these issues better, again, I wish I could give a more encouraging answer. I do think it's encouraging. This was another of the people writing in that so far, Harris and Walz have been really highlighting Project 2025, which is the playbook for a second Trump term. And it is this sprawling document of anti-democratic power grabs that will occur in a second Trump administration. So I would also, encourage your listeners to investigate. The Nation actually had a cover story a couple of issues back, breaking down all of the proposals in Project 2025. But it is crucial, as your listener said, to highlight these core differences, particularly as they pertain to preserving what remains of America's formal democracy. It's interesting, just as a sidelight, that was kind of the main thrust of Biden's general election campaign, was to talk about the democracy threat. And I think we're seeing now this important shift, both in terms of what we've been discussing and by way of progressive policy making under Walz, but also, no one's mentioned the weird criticism that has really landed very powerfully. And you see it again in Walz's applause line, mind your own damn business. There's a real, I think, effective and powerful message there that, these are people who are determined to meddle with our lives in a really scary way. And it includes tampering with the ballot and ballot access, but it also includes all this other stuff as well.
We should also say that we're going to definitely do shows about what's going on in Georgia and other Republican states. We're also going to talk about voter suppression. USA Today had a piece 2 weeks ago. New Georgia law makes voter intimidation easier. Critics say it affects black voters the most. We also know that voters are being kicked off of the rolls. And so tell everyone you know they have to do it now and consistently until ballots start arriving. Turbovote.org will help you check your registration. Turbovote.org. So be sure to tell everyone you know to check their registration, especially if they live in a Republican-controlled state, because we know that people are being thrown off the rolls. Chris Lehman is D.C. Bureau Chief for The Nation and author of The Money Cult, Capitalism, Christianity, and the Unmaking of the American Dream. David Perry is a journalist and co-author of The Bright Ages, A New History of Medieval Europe. He's also a historian. Will Bunch is national opinion columnist for the Philadelphia Inquirer and author of After the Ivory Tower Falls, How College Broke the American Dream and Blew Up Our Politics and How to Fix It. Thank you all for your work, and thank you for joining us.
Thanks so much, Rose.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks to Malihe Razazan for producing today's show. Thanks to Kevin Vance for engineering our show. Thank you for joining us. I'm Rose Aguilar. It's your call.